The life and legacy of George Washington, a man whose name would become inseparable from the birth of a nation. In the gentle, undulating hills of Westmoreland County, Virginia, on a cool February 22nd morning in 1732, a child came into the world destined to alter the course of history. That child was George Washington. Born not into royalty nor immense wealth, but into a modest gentry family, he carried no titles, no crown. Yet his path was already etched quietly and irrevocably into the tapestry of a rising world. His parents, Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, belonged to Virginia's landowning class, respectable though far from the elite. From an early age, George was surrounded by tobacco fields, family responsibilities, and the looming shadow of colonial tensions. When he was just 11 years old, his father died, a loss that shifted the arc of his youth. Formal education, already limited, became even more sporadic. But what he lacked in schooling, he more than compensated for in self-discipline, relentless curiosity, and an extraordinary sense of personal responsibility. Drawn to the practical over the theoretical, young George immersed himself in surveying, mathematics, and geometry. At 17, while most boys his age were still under the care of tutors or family estates, Washington was traversing the vast and often unforgiving frontier of Virginia as a licensed land surveyor. With compass in hand and a sharp eye for terrain, he charted lands still rough and unsettled, developing not only physical endurance but a keen understanding of the land and the politics that surrounded it. It was out on those frontier trails, surrounded by uncertainty and raw opportunity, that Washington began to shape himself not just as a man of strength, but as one of vision. By the age of 20, Washington joined the Virginia militia. It was a decision that would pull him deeper into the complexities of colonial power, native alliances, and British ambitions in North America. His first real test of leadership came in the Ohio River Valley, a region hotly contested by British, French, and indigenous nations alike. In 1754, a young Lieutenant Colonel Washington led a mission that sparked the French and Indian War, a global conflict in miniature played out in North America's dense forests and rugged hills. Though not without mistakes, his early military career forged a reputation for courage, endurance, and tactical determination. Washington learned the realities of war, not the glory promised in textbooks, but the muddy, bloody calculus of logistics, weather, and morale. He watched seasoned officers falter, saw the limits of British arrogance, and understood that leadership was often less about commands and more about trust. When the war ended, Washington returned to Virginia not as a celebrated general, but as a man changed. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow whose fortune offered stability and influence. Together, they settled at Mount Vernon, a sprawling estate that would become Washington's sanctuary and legacy. Though never blessed with biological children, George raised Martha's children as his own, nurturing a household that balanced social stature with personal humility. For a time, he could have remained simply a gentleman farmer, a respected figure among Virginia's elite. But the tides of history were swelling. Across the colonies, unrest simmered. Taxation without representation. British troops in American towns. The sting of imperial control tightening with each passing year. And George Washington, with his quiet gravitas and reputation for integrity, was called again, not by ambition, but by duty. In 1775, with revolution in the air, the Continental Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was a bold decision. Washington had no formal military education, no victories against European powers. But he carried something else: steadfastness, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief in the cause of liberty. The war that followed tested him beyond measure. The winter at Valley Forge. The endless shortages of food, supplies, and money. The uncertainty of foreign support. The uneven performance of militia troops. Yet Washington endured. Not through flashy victories, but through resolve. He held the army together, inspired loyalty when it seemed impossible, and turned a ragtag force into something resembling a nation's defense. His leadership culminated in the decisive victory at Yorktown in 1781. With French support and strategic brilliance, Washington cornered the British forces under Cornwallis, forcing their surrender. It was the end of British colonial rule and the beginning of something entirely new. But perhaps Washington's most powerful moment came after the war, when he chose to relinquish power. Unlike so many revolutionaries who become tyrants, Washington stepped aside. In 1783, he resigned his commission, returning not to a throne, but to Mount Vernon. King George III reportedly said that if Washington gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And so he became precisely that. When the fledgling United States stumbled in its first attempt at self-governance, it was Washington the people turned to. He was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States in 1789. No campaign, no speeches, just trust. As president, he set precedents still followed today: the peaceful transfer of power, a 2-term limit, a cabinet of advisors, neutrality in foreign affairs. He built the office without blueprint. With grace and restraint, he navigated political faction, rebellion, and the delicate balance between liberty and order. In 1797, after 2 terms, he did what no world leader had done before. He voluntarily stepped down from power once more. He retired to Mount Vernon, where he spent his final years tending to his land, corresponding with national leaders, and watching the Republic take shape. He passed away in December 1799, leaving behind not just a nation, but an ideal. George Washington was not perfect. He was a man of his time, complicated, contradictory, and shaped by the culture around him. He owned enslaved people. He struggled with federal power. He distrusted political parties. But he also believed in the fragile promise of democracy, in the power of civic virtue, in the idea that leadership must serve, not rule. He once said, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." That experiment continues. But its first architect, its quiet, towering pillar, was George Washington. His firm stance on principle may have cost him re-election, but history would eventually recognize him as being ahead of his time. In the year 1800, John Adams lost the presidency to his longtime rival and former vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Yet what might have been seen as defeat became instead a milestone in American political development, the very first peaceful transition of executive power between opposing factions in the history of the United States. No violence, no military intervention, just ballots, acceptance, and dignity. Adams quietly packed his belongings and departed Washington before dawn. There was no ceremony, no bitterness publicly displayed. He returned to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, not as a defeated politician, but as a man of letters, a thinker, and a father. His political career had closed its final chapter, but a quieter, more introspective story was beginning. In the calm of his post-presidency years, Adams turned to reading and writing with fervor. He filled pages with thoughts on government, morality, theology, and revolution. His home was filled with the noise of grandchildren and the rustle of newspapers. He walked the orchard in the early mornings, often deep in thought, carrying in his mind the weight and triumphs of a country he helped forge. It was during these reflective years that Adams reconnected with someone he once called an apostate. His old friend turned political enemy, Thomas Jefferson. Their reconciliation is one of the most profound chapters in American history. After years of cold silence and public disagreement, the two men, both aging, both watching their legacies evolve, began writing to one another. The letters they exchanged were long, thoughtful, and deeply philosophical. They discussed everything from classical history to government structure, from the failures of the French Revolution to the role of virtue in a republic. Each letter served as both reflection and resolution, a dialogue not only between two men but between two founding ideologies, the Federalist and the Republican, the realist and the idealist. Through ink and parchment, they found common ground, revisiting their shared past and finding peace in the wisdom of age. Over the span of 14 years, Adams and Jefferson exchanged 158 letters. The correspondence is now considered a national treasure, a masterclass in political thought, mutual respect, and reconciliation. It revealed not only their intellect, but their humanity. As the nation approached its 50th anniversary in 1826, both men were nearing the ends of their lives. The summer was hot, the air thick, and on July 4th, the very date they had helped to immortalize half a century earlier, John Adams lay on his deathbed. He was surrounded by family, frail but lucid. His breathing had grown shallow. The fire within him, once roaring with revolution, was now flickering its final light. His last recorded words were murmured with reverence, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He believed, in those final moments, that his old friend, his rival, his counterpart, was still alive, still carrying the flame of their shared dream. What he did not know was that just a few hours earlier, Thomas Jefferson had also drawn his final breath. Two men, two minds, two legacies woven through the same fabric of independence. Gone on the same day, gone on the exact birthday of the nation they had declared into being. Historians and poets alike could scarcely believe it. It felt like the closing of an epic, the final chapter written not by man, but by fate. As if the soul of the revolution needed both of them to remain until the semi-centennial of its birth, and then, with a sigh, let them rest. Their deaths marked not just the end of an era, but the passing of living memory. They were the last of the great philosopher kings, the men who knew freedom not as theory, but as struggle, as risk, as blood and ink. The legacy of John Adams is often seen in the shadow of Washington or Jefferson, but his contributions were no less vital. He was a brilliant legal mind, a tireless advocate for independence, and a president who valued principle above popularity. He once said, "I must study politics and war so that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." And indeed, he did. His writings shaped generations. His vision, though rigid at times, was guided by a moral compass that rarely wavered. He was not a man who courted affection, but one who demanded respect through thought and conviction. Where Jefferson dreamed in idealistic phrases, Adams built foundations of practical law. Where Hamilton charged with ambition, Adams held firm with balance. He was, in many ways, the conscience of the revolution, the reminder that liberty, once won, must be preserved not with passion alone, but with reason and restraint. Today, the Adams legacy lives not only in the books and letters he left behind, but in the enduring idea that political disagreement need not become permanent enmity. That dialogue, however fierce, can lead back to understanding. That losing power gracefully is one of the highest acts of democratic strength. He and Jefferson remind us that democracy is not just about who wins, but how we honor each other in disagreement, how we let go of power, how we carry the flame forward. They remind us that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility, a fragile inheritance passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. And as John Adams once wrote, liberty, once lost, is lost forever. So we remember, and we continue. Following the ratification of the Constitution, James Madison continued to play a vital role in shaping not only its structure but its acceptance. Together with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, Madison co-authored a series of influential essays under the collective title The Federalist Papers. These writings, forceful, elegant, and deeply reasoned, were aimed at persuading skeptical Americans of the merits of the newly proposed Constitution. Each essay addressed fears, countered arguments, and championed the balance between federal authority and individual rights. Among the collection, Madison's contributions stand out with enduring brilliance. Federalist Number 10 examined the danger of factions, groups of citizens driven by self-interest, and argued for a large republic as the best defense against tyranny by the majority. Federalist Number 51 addressed the necessity of checks and balances, famously declaring, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." These essays remain foundational texts in political theory courses around the world, still cited for their clarity and foresight. Madison wasn't just defending a document, he was articulating a vision for what democratic governance could be, rooted not in the whims of kings or the chaos of mobs, but in a structure built on reason, justice, and the rule of law. Though he initially hesitated to support amendments to the newly minted Constitution, fearing they might unravel what had just been so carefully assembled, Madison listened. He heard the voices of critics, anti-federalists who worried that without explicit protections, the federal government might trample on personal liberties. Their concerns echoed throughout the states. So when Madison was elected to the very first United States Congress as a representative from Virginia, he took decisive action. Drawing on his deep understanding of governance and his ability to craft compromise, he led the effort to write a series of amendments that would become known as the Bill of Rights. In 1791, 10 of those amendments were ratified. Among them were the bedrock freedoms we now consider inseparable from American identity: the right to speak freely, to practice religion without coercion, to publish without censorship, to gather in protest, and to be protected under due process of law. Madison had once again demonstrated that he was not merely a theoretician or legislator, but a guardian of liberty, responsive to the call for fairness and dignity in governance. By then, Madison's reputation as a constitutional architect was secure, but his personal life, too, was evolving in profound ways. In 1794, at the age of 43, he married Dolly Payne Todd, a young widow known for her charisma, intelligence, and magnetic presence in social circles. Where Madison was quiet, reserved, and analytical, Dolly sparkled with warmth and grace. She had an intuitive understanding of people, of presentation, and of how relationships could shape politics. Their union was one of deep affection and mutual respect, each complementing the other in both personal and public life. Dolly would eventually become one of the most beloved first ladies in American history, a woman whose charm softened political divides and whose poise would prove crucial in moments of national uncertainty. Together, James and Dolly Madison became a force in Washington's early social and political scene. Madison's public service continued, including a pivotal role as Secretary of State under President Thomas Jefferson. During this time, he oversaw the Louisiana Purchase, the vast territorial expansion that doubled the size of the young nation. It was a move that shifted the course of American history, opening the door to westward expansion, new states, and a complex set of political challenges. But it was in 1809 that Madison assumed the role for which many would remember him most, the presidency. Elected as the fourth president of the United States, James Madison inherited a country caught between empires. British impressment of American sailors, restrictions on U.S. trade, and growing tensions on the frontier were pulling the nation toward conflict. For a man so deeply committed to diplomacy and constitutional process, the prospect of war was anathema. And yet war came. In 1812, under mounting pressure and nationalist fervor, Madison signed the declaration that launched the United States into its first major international conflict, the War of 1812. It was a war fraught with setbacks and humiliations. The British invaded Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol and the White House. Madison himself was forced to flee the capital. But amid the chaos, there were moments of resilience and unity, none more famous than Dolly Madison's decision to save a full-length portrait of George Washington from the flames. That single act became symbolic, the past being carried forward through the fire. Though the war ended inconclusively in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, it sparked a renewed sense of American identity. The young republic had stood up to Britain once more and survived. It was not a victory in military terms, but a kind of psychological independence was achieved, a confirmation that the United States could endure even under duress. When Madison left office in 1817, he retired to his estate at Montpelier. But even in retirement, his work was far from over. He spent his later years overseeing his farm, corresponding with national leaders, and helping establish the University of Virginia alongside Jefferson. He remained a voice of wisdom and a defender of the republic he helped conceive. James Madison died in 1836 at the age of 85, the last surviving signer of the Constitution. His legacy is immense. He is remembered not only as the father of the Constitution, but as a thinker who understood the fragility of freedom and the necessity of structure. He believed that liberty must be protected not just by passion, but by law. Not just by ideals, but by institutions capable of withstanding time. And he gave us those institutions. Through his words, his actions, and his unwavering commitment to democratic governance, James Madison offered the country a framework not only for how to begin, but how to endure. He was born into privilege, but forged for purpose. John Quincy Adams, son of the revolutionary patriarch John Adams and the fiercely intelligent Abigail Adams, was immersed in the ideals of liberty and service from his earliest days. By the time he reached adolescence, he was already fluent in multiple languages and had lived through the upheavals of revolution and diplomacy alike. His childhood was anything but ordinary. It was carved out of embassies, courtrooms, and candlelit desks filled with treaties and translations. He studied at elite European academies, absorbed Enlightenment philosophy firsthand, and eventually returned to the United States to attend Harvard University. His education was not only academic, it was diplomatic, philosophical, and deeply personal. He witnessed firsthand the fragile birth of new nations, the fall of kings, and the price of self-governance. At just 14 years old, he was already serving as secretary to the American envoy in Russia, assisting with translation and dispatches in a world ruled by monarchs and ministers. By the age of 26, he had been appointed as U.S. minister to the Netherlands and shortly thereafter to Prussia. His dispatches were admired for their clarity, strategy, and insight. George Washington himself acknowledged the young diplomat's exceptional promise, calling him the ablest of all our young men. Though born with the refinement of a statesman's pedigree, Adams never rested on legacy. His mission was not inheritance, but the Republic, and he served it with relentless purpose. In 1803, John Quincy Adams entered the U.S. Senate as a representative of Massachusetts. A nominal Federalist by party, he quickly demonstrated that party lines would not contain him. He stood with conviction over conformity. He supported Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, an act that directly opposed Federalist ideology. His vote infuriated many of his colleagues and party leaders, but Adams held firm. He believed the acquisition was critical to the expansion and survival of the nation. His independence earned him a maverick reputation. Adams was a man who walked his own path, guided by ethics, foresight, and a vision not beholden to popularity. Soon after, President James Madison appointed him U.S. Minister to Russia, a role in which he once again proved invaluable. While in St. Petersburg, Adams navigated court politics, secured trade interests, and provided detailed intelligence that helped shape American foreign policy. His diplomatic career only continued to ascend from there. He would go on to serve as the chief negotiator at the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, restoring peace with Britain and reestablishing national honor. No territory was lost. No reparations were demanded. For a young republic still finding its place on the world stage, it was a defining moment, and Adams was at its heart. In 1817, John Quincy Adams was named Secretary of State under President James Monroe. This post would become the most influential chapter of his diplomatic life. As secretary, Adams was instrumental in shaping what would later be known as the Monroe Doctrine, a bold declaration that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization. It was a foreign policy stance that would define American posture for generations to come. Under Adams' guidance, U.S. diplomacy shifted from reactive to assertive, defending sovereignty across the Americas. He also negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty, securing Florida from Spain and clarifying boundaries with Spanish territories to the west. With these accomplishments, Adams became widely regarded as one of the most accomplished secretaries of state in American history. In 1824, he sought the presidency. The election of 1824 would go down as one of the most controversial in American political history. No candidate secured a majority of the electoral vote, sending the decision to the House of Representatives. There, Adams was selected over Andrew Jackson in what Jackson's supporters would later call the corrupt bargain. Though no wrongdoing was ever proven, the perception of backroom deals lingered, and it would haunt Adams throughout his presidency. Despite entering office under a cloud of suspicion, Adams remained focused on policy. He envisioned a nation built on infrastructure, education, and scientific advancement. He proposed the construction of roads, canals, a national university, and even an astronomical observatory. He believed government should serve not just the present, but the future. But Adams was a man ahead of his time. Congress balked at many of his proposals, viewing them as overreach. His political enemies, particularly Jacksonians, portrayed him as elitist, out of touch, and cold. He lacked the populist charm that American politics was beginning to favor. His refusal to engage in political patronage or emotional campaigning cost him dearly. In 1828, he lost his bid for re-election to Andrew Jackson. Most men, having served as president, would have retired into quiet dignity. But John Quincy Adams was not most men. In 1830, he did the unthinkable. He ran for Congress, and he won. He became the only U.S. president to return to the House of Representatives after leaving the White House. He served there for 17 more years, representing Massachusetts with unwavering intensity. It was in Congress that Adams arguably performed his most courageous work. He became the leading voice against slavery, a moral crusader in a chamber dominated by silence and compromise on the issue. He fought against the gag rule, which prohibited discussion of anti-slavery petitions. He battled daily against Southern power, speaking not for applause, but for posterity. Even when censured, even when outnumbered, he refused to stop. When he collapsed on the floor of the House in 1848, felled by a stroke, it was within the very halls he had defended so fiercely. He died 2 days later in the Speaker's room, surrounded by colleagues and the echo of battles still unfinished. John Quincy Adams left behind a legacy of relentless principle, a statesman who refused to bend, a diplomat who shaped borders, a congressman who gave voice to conscience, a man who believed that service to country never truly ends, not with title, not with age, and not even with defeat. His name was Martin Van Buren, and he would become the first president born after the American Revolution, the first to be born a citizen of the United States rather than a British subject, and the first to prove that politics was not just a calling, but a profession, a game even, and he could play it better than anyone else of his time. Van Buren's heritage was distinctly Dutch. Born in Kinderhook, New York, in 1782, he grew up speaking Dutch as his native tongue, only learning English fluently later in his youth. His father ran a tavern and small farm, which became young Martin's first school of politics. At the tavern tables, farmers, travelers, and party men gathered to talk shop, negotiate deals, and debate local rumors and national headlines. Martin watched and listened, quietly, carefully, and with purpose. In that smoky room of shifting alliances and strong opinions, the boy began to understand something most of his contemporaries did not. That power was not just about ideas or courage, but about relationships, loyalty, organization. Van Buren's intelligence was keen and fast-moving. He read people with remarkable accuracy and learned to anticipate motives before they were spoken aloud. Though he never attended college, he pursued law through apprenticeship and was admitted to the bar at the age of 21. But even as a young lawyer, his eye was on politics, not the theory of it, but the machinery behind it. In the rough and tumble arena of New York State politics, Van Buren was in his element. He became a master of political organization, building coalitions brick by brick. He believed in the importance of structure, party committees, regional alliances, and a shared message. He understood how to reward loyalty and marginalize opposition. In time, he helped construct what would be called the Albany Regency, a political machine that turned New York into a model of disciplined, coordinated party politics. His vision wasn't merely tactical, it was transformational. At a time when many still viewed political parties as dangerous or divisive, Van Buren saw them as essential to democracy. Parties gave the people a voice. Parties provided order. Parties created accountability. He would one day call political parties indispensable to the successful working of our system. This belief became the foundation of his rise to national prominence. Van Buren's alliance with Andrew Jackson would become one of the most powerful political partnerships in American history. Though different in temperament, Jackson was hot-blooded and impulsive, Van Buren cool and calculating. They complemented each other with remarkable balance. Van Buren helped Jackson channel his popularity into effective political strategy. He was the architect behind Jackson's presidential victory in 1828, organizing a national campaign that appealed to the expanding electorate and set new standards for political messaging and mobilization. After Jackson's election, Van Buren was appointed Secretary of State, where he skillfully navigated foreign affairs and strengthened his standing in the president's inner circle. When a cabinet rift erupted, the so-called petticoat affair, Van Buren emerged as a calming force, supporting Jackson's positions while carefully managing alliances. Jackson grew to trust him deeply. In 1832, Van Buren was elected vice president, and 4 years later, with Jackson's full endorsement, he succeeded him as the 8th president of the United States. But the presidency so long prepared for proved treacherous. Just weeks after Van Buren took office, the nation was plunged into economic disaster. The Panic of 1837, a banking collapse triggered by speculative lending, falling cotton prices, and Jacksonian financial policies, sent shockwaves through the country. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and public confidence evaporated. Van Buren, a fiscal conservative by philosophy, refused to use federal funds for direct relief. He believed government aid would undermine individual responsibility and long-term stability. Instead, he proposed an independent treasury system, separating government funds from private banks to safeguard the economy from future crashes. Though the move was principled and eventually praised, it brought him no short-term political gain. The public, suffering and angry, wanted immediate action, and Van Buren's careful detachment felt cold. He also inherited Jackson's controversial legacy on Native American removal. Though Van Buren personally expressed discomfort with aspects of the policy, he did little to reverse it. The infamous Trail of Tears, forced relocations of native nations, continued during his presidency, casting a long shadow over his legacy. Despite his political brilliance, Van Buren was not a man of fire or rhetoric. He was a quiet strategist, not a charismatic orator. And in an age where the public increasingly craved relatable leaders, his aloofness cost him. In 1840, he faced a resurgent Whig party that attacked him relentlessly. They mocked him as Martin Van Ruin, blamed him for the Depression, and presented their candidate, William Henry Harrison, as a log cabin-loving, cider-drinking man of the people. It was a carefully crafted illusion. Harrison was, in fact, an aristocrat, but it worked. Van Buren lost the election in a landslide, but he didn't disappear. In 1848, Van Buren returned to the national stage, not as a Democrat, but as the presidential candidate for the Free Soil Party, a coalition of anti-slavery Democrats, Whigs, and abolitionists who opposed the expansion of slavery into Western territories. His candidacy split the vote and helped ensure a Whig victory, but it marked a turning point in his legacy. Though he had once upheld compromises with slaveholding interests, Van Buren had come to believe that slavery's expansion must be stopped. It was a personal and political evolution, one that spoke to the deeper currents shaping the American conscience. He spent his later years reflecting, writing, and watching as the political system he helped build transformed and fractured under the weight of new moral and regional divides. Martin Van Buren died in 1862, as the nation he once led was torn apart by civil war. His legacy is complex. Architect of modern political machinery, advocate for party organization, master of the invisible hand behind the scenes. A president burdened by economic catastrophe, a strategist who saw government as system rather than spectacle. But more than anything, Van Buren was proof that democracy, messy, shifting, imperfect, needs engineers as much as orators, builders as much as dreamers, and he built the scaffolding on which the modern presidency still stands. He began his public career young, becoming a legislator at just 17 and a lawyer by 19. But the fire that truly burned in John Tyler was political in nature. The son of Virginia aristocracy, Tyler was raised on a steady diet of classical republicanism, reverence for the Constitution, and deep suspicion of centralized power. And from the very beginning, he followed that creed with stubborn resolve. Tyler quickly ascended through the ranks of public service, from the Virginia House of Delegates to the U.S. House of Representatives, then to Governor of Virginia, and eventually to the United States Senate. Throughout each post, he consistently positioned himself as a champion of states' rights and a skeptic of federal overreach. He voted based on conviction, not party loyalty, which earned him a reputation for integrity, but also one for unpredictability. Originally aligned with the Democratic Party, Tyler grew disillusioned with the increasingly autocratic tendencies of Andrew Jackson's presidency. Jackson's forceful use of executive authority, especially in the bank war and his disregard for states' autonomy, clashed with Tyler's strict constitutionalism. Seeking a political home more aligned with his principles, he broke ranks and joined the newly formed Whig Party, a coalition built on opposition to Jacksonian dominance. It was an uneasy fit. Tyler didn't share the Whigs' affection for federal infrastructure projects or their loose interpretation of executive power. But in 1840, Whig leaders were looking for balance, and Tyler provided it. That year, the Whigs nominated the aging war hero William Henry Harrison for president. To broaden the ticket and appeal to Southern voters, they chose Tyler as his running mate. The campaign was a theatrical affair, filled with log cabins, hard cider barrels, and the now famous slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." The ticket triumphed in a landslide, but no one could have predicted what came next. Just 31 days into his presidency, William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia, the first president to die in office. A constitutional question immediately followed. What exactly does the vice president become in such a case? Some in Congress believed Tyler should merely serve as acting president. Others proposed that a new election should be called. But Tyler, with quiet assertiveness, rejected all ambiguity. He took the presidential oath and declared himself the 10th president of the United States. No modifiers, no half measures. In doing so, he established a precedent that would define the nation's constitutional continuity. The vice president becomes president in full upon the incumbent's death. That singular act of clarity became known as the Tyler precedent, and it has guided every presidential succession since. But if Tyler's rise was swift, his presidency proved tempestuous. Almost immediately, he found himself at odds with the very party that had elevated him. The Whigs, led by powerful figures like Henry Clay, expected Tyler to support their legislative agenda, chief among them, a national bank. But Tyler, unwavering in his constitutional philosophy, vetoed two separate bills to reestablish the Bank of the United States. He viewed such institutions as dangerous concentrations of economic and political power. The fallout was explosive. Whig leaders denounced Tyler. His entire cabinet, save one, resigned in protest. Party newspapers turned against him, branding him his accidency and the man without a party. For the remainder of his term, Tyler governed in political isolation, with no party apparatus to back him and a hostile Congress intent on curbing his influence. Despite the animosity, Tyler pressed forward. He successfully resolved a long-standing border dispute with Britain through the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, securing peace and clarifying boundaries between the U.S. and Canada. He also laid the groundwork for westward expansion, particularly focusing on the annexation of Texas, a fiercely controversial topic that would reshape the nation and intensify sectional tensions over slavery. Tyler's push for Texas annexation met stiff resistance in Congress. Many feared it would provoke war with Mexico and tip the delicate balance between free and slave states. Yet Tyler was undeterred. In the final days of his presidency, he maneuvered to get a joint resolution through Congress, setting the stage for Texas to join the Union shortly after he left office. But Tyler's legacy was not sealed with the Texas question alone. After leaving the White House in 1845, he retreated to his plantation, Sherwood Forest, in Virginia. Yet, as the nation edged toward civil war, Tyler re-entered the political fray, not as a unifier, but as a Southern loyalist. In 1861, he chaired the Peace Conference in Washington, an 11th-hour attempt to avert secession and civil conflict. But when the Confederacy formed, Tyler cast his lot with Virginia and the South. He was even elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, though he died before he could take his seat. For this allegiance, Tyler became the only former U.S. president not officially mourned in Washington upon his death. No flag flew at half-staff. No congressional tribute was delivered. To many in the North, he had betrayed the nation he once led. And yet, Tyler's presidency left enduring marks, both constitutional and political. He proved that the executive branch was not merely a passive instrument of Congress. He asserted the independence of the presidency, even when it cost him everything. He set precedents that would stabilize the transfer of power. He navigated foreign diplomacy, brokered territorial expansion, and refused to bend his convictions for the sake of convenience. John Tyler was not beloved in his lifetime, nor was he universally admired. But in the long view of history, he stands as a complex figure, rigid in principle, flawed in allegiance, but undeniably impactful. In many ways, he was the first to wrestle with the contradictions of executive power in a republic designed to fear it. And in that struggle, he left behind a legacy still debated, still relevant, and still unresolved. It began with a modest commission but would evolve into a 4-decade journey that etched him into the nation's consciousness as both warrior and president. Zachary Taylor didn't come from political ambition or elite schooling. Instead, his path was cut through muddy battlefields and rugged command posts. A man of few words and fewer pretenses, Taylor's reputation was forged in action. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War. In each, he earned respect not through fiery speeches or tactical innovation, but through his steadfast leadership and his ability to endure alongside the common soldier. His troops called him Old Rough and Ready, a nickname born of grit, not glamour. Taylor slept in tents beside his men, wore dusty uniforms into battle, and ate the same hard rations. They followed him not because he commanded, but because he shared. Yet it was during the Mexican-American War that Taylor emerged as a national legend. In 1846, as tensions with Mexico exploded into war over disputed territory in Texas and along the Rio Grande, Taylor was given command of U.S. forces. What followed was a string of battlefield successes that stunned both his peers and his enemies. At Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey, Taylor demonstrated calm resolve under fire. He maneuvered his troops with determination, holding the line when others might have retreated. But it was the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847 that would elevate him to the status of national hero. At Buena Vista, Taylor and his men found themselves heavily outnumbered by the forces of Mexican General Antonio López de Santa Anna. The situation was desperate. Supplies were limited. Morale was fragile. But Taylor refused to surrender or retreat. He famously wrote to Washington, "I shall win or die." And he won. The victory electrified the American public. Here was a general who wasn't seeking fame but had found it nonetheless. Newspapers sang his praises. Folk songs bore his name. Political parties took notice. Zachary Taylor had never cast a vote in a presidential election. He had no political resume. He didn't identify clearly with any party. But his popularity was so overwhelming and his reputation for honesty and simplicity so strong that he became the natural choice for the Whig Party in the 1848 presidential election. He accepted the nomination reluctantly. Taylor was no statesman. He had never delivered a political speech or studied the finer points of governance. But he believed in service, and the people believed in him. His campaign was unconventional, leaning entirely on his war record and humble image. Old Rough and Ready became a symbol of unpolished integrity, a stark contrast to the polished politicians of Washington. He won the election, defeating Democratic candidate Lewis Cass, and became the 12th president of the United States. But Taylor's presidency would be short and complicated. The most pressing issue facing the country during his term was slavery and the looming threat of disunion. New territories acquired from Mexico reignited fierce debates over whether slavery should expand into the western frontier. The country was teetering on the edge of sectional crisis. Though Taylor was a Southerner and a slaveholder himself, his position shocked many. He opposed the extension of slavery into the new territories. He believed that new states should decide for themselves and that the federal government should not interfere. But he also believed that the Union was sacred and that secession was treason. In private, he warned Southern leaders that if they tried to break from the Union, he would use military force to stop them. He did not speak like a politician, but like a general. His firm stance drew fierce opposition from Southern politicians and puzzled members of his own party. Taylor was not aligned with either the pro-slavery or abolitionist blocs. He followed no party line, issued few clear policy proposals, and seemed to govern more by instinct than ideology. And then, suddenly, his presidency ended. On July 4, 1850, after attending Independence Day ceremonies in sweltering Washington heat, Taylor became ill. His condition rapidly worsened over the next several days, and on July 9th, he died just 16 months into his term. Speculation and conspiracy theories swirled around his death for years. Was he poisoned? Did political enemies fear his resolve to hold the Union together at any cost? Modern science has found no evidence of foul play, attributing his death to acute gastroenteritis likely caused by contaminated food or water. But the questions linger because so much of Taylor's potential remained unrealized. He was succeeded by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who quickly reversed many of Taylor's positions and signed the Compromise of 1850 into law, an act Taylor likely would have opposed. This compromise, which allowed California to enter as a free state but introduced stricter fugitive slave laws, temporarily calmed tensions but deepened moral and political divides. Zachary Taylor left no sweeping legislative legacy. He passed no great reforms. He gave no memorable speeches. And yet, his impact was profound. He was a man of clarity in a time of increasing division. A president who, despite personal ties to the institution of slavery, recognized the paramount importance of national unity. A soldier-turned-statesman who governed with a plain-spoken honesty that both comforted and confounded. His life was one of service without spectacle. He didn't seek greatness. It came to him. And in the crucible of war and politics, he chose country over comfort, union over region, principle over party. In death, as in life, Zachary Taylor remained old, rough, and ready to stand, ready to serve, ready to lead. He was born in the quiet hills of New Hampshire, but his journey would carry him into the stormy center of a nation on the verge of collapse. Franklin Pierce was known for his warmth, his eloquence, and a personal charm that endeared him to nearly everyone he met. Handsome, magnetic, and deeply courteous, he seemed destined for high office from a young age. His early years were marked by promise and connection. He formed friendships that would last a lifetime, including one with future author Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose brooding reflections would later echo Pierce's own troubled path. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Pierce had already been elected to the New Hampshire legislature, then to the U.S. House of Representatives, and later to the Senate, becoming its youngest member at the time. Despite his rapid rise, he remained modest in demeanor, never boastful or overbearing. He detested personal conflict and clung to the hope that compromise could preserve unity. He was a man of peace in an era increasingly defined by tension. Pierce married Jane Means Appleton, the soft-spoken and deeply religious daughter of a college president. Where Franklin was social and spirited, Jane was withdrawn and melancholic. Theirs was a marriage of affection and friction. She hated politics. She hated Washington. And though she loved her husband, she found no joy in the public life that surrounded him. Out of love for her, Pierce stepped away from the political stage. In 1842, he resigned from the Senate, returning to New Hampshire and private law practice. He sought quietude. He longed for the serenity of domestic life, the rolling countryside, and the simplicity of family. But fate rarely grants long peace to those marked by destiny. When the Mexican-American War erupted, Pierce answered the call, joining the army as a brigadier general. He did not seek the glory of command, but neither did he shrink from duty. In battle, he proved brave if not tactically brilliant, falling from his horse and suffering injuries, yet refusing to leave the field. His commitment earned respect, and his national profile grew. In 1852, the Democratic Party found itself fractured and adrift. Its national convention dragged on for 48 ballots with no consensus candidate in sight. Then, as if from nowhere, a compromise emerged: Franklin Pierce. He was a fresh face, a Northerner with Southern sympathies. He had no polarizing record, no inflammatory speeches. To many, he was the embodiment of unity and acceptable middle ground in a nation tearing itself apart. He won the presidency in a landslide. But even before he took office, tragedy struck. Just weeks before the inauguration, Pierce, Jane, and their young son, Benjamin, boarded a train bound for Boston. The car derailed. As it tumbled, their son was thrown from the wreck and killed instantly. Franklin and Jane witnessed the entire horror, unable to save him. It was their last surviving child. Jane never recovered. She sank deeper into sorrow, interpreting the accident as divine punishment for entering politics. She retreated from public view entirely, refusing to attend social functions and often writing letters to her deceased son. Pierce, devastated, took office with a heart already broken. And so began one of the most sorrowful presidencies in American history. Pierce entered the White House determined to preserve the Union, but the very forces threatening to tear it apart now swirled around him. The issue of slavery's expansion into the Western territories loomed large, and Pierce's approach to resolving it would become his undoing. In 1854, he signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, an explosive piece of legislation that repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. In theory, it was democracy. In practice, it was bloodshed. Almost immediately, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and violent clashes erupted. Bleeding Kansas became a symbol of national failure, proof that compromise rather than soothing division could ignite it. Pierce, rather than condemning the violence, appeared to side with pro-slavery forces. He condemned anti-slavery groups as troublemakers, alienating Northern voters who had once supported him. His enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, ordering federal authorities to return escaped slaves, deepened the perception that he was beholden to Southern interests. Pierce's attempts to annex Cuba through the secretive and ill-fated Ostend Manifesto only added to his woes. The leaked documents suggested that if Spain refused to sell Cuba, the U.S. might take it by force, infuriating Northerners who saw it as an attempt to expand slavery abroad. Public opinion soured quickly. The man once hailed as a unifier now stood accused of betrayal. In 1856, his party declined to renominate him for a second term. He left office politically isolated and widely criticized. His post-presidency years were marked by bitterness and isolation. He criticized Abraham Lincoln's wartime policies and expressed sympathy for the Southern cause, not because he supported slavery, but because he believed federal power had grown too strong. Old friendships faded. His health deteriorated. Jane, still consumed by grief, passed away in 1863. Franklin turned increasingly to alcohol, a struggle that had haunted him for years. He died in 1869, largely forgotten and dismissed by the public he had once so brightly inspired. Yet Pierce remains a figure of haunting contradiction. He was a man of intellect, charm, and grace whose every political instinct seemed to fail him at the most critical moment. A man who longed for unity but presided over its unraveling. A man who loved deeply but lost nearly everything he cared for. His presidency is often ranked among the weakest. And yet, his story is not one of villainy but of tragedy. Franklin Pierce reminds us that sometimes the gentlest hearts are least suited for the rough winds of history. That leadership demands not only good intention but unshakable conviction. And that the weight of sorrow, when carried in silence, can crumble even the strongest shoulders. In the rugged expanse of Hardin County, Kentucky, a boy was born who would one day become the soul of a fractured nation. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He entered the world in a one-room log cabin in 1809, the son of Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, frontier farmers of limited means and boundless resilience. Life was hard. The land was untamed. The comforts of civilization were distant and rare. The family moved often, pushing westward with the rhythm of the American frontier, first to Indiana, then eventually to Illinois. When Lincoln was just 9 years old, his mother died of milk sickness, a slow and painful illness common in the wilderness. Her death left a wound in him that never fully healed. Though his stepmother, Sarah, would become a source of affection and strength, the ache of that early loss remained like a shadow. Formal education was nearly non-existent in Lincoln's youth, less than a single year total. But he was ravenous for knowledge. Every book he could get his hands on became a new world to conquer. By firelight, he read the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's fables, and legal texts. These pages formed the foundations of a mind not trained in universities but forged in silence and solitude. He grew tall, awkwardly so, with long limbs and a slightly stooped frame. But with the same frame came strength. He split rails for fences, guided flatboats down the Mississippi, worked as a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor, and a self-taught lawyer. He could hold a room with stories, silence a crowd with logic, or disarm an enemy with unexpected empathy. In New Salem and later Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln built a reputation brick by brick, not just as a skilled lawyer, but as a man of honesty, humor, and humble dignity. He earned the nickname Honest Abe not through self-promotion, but through a relentless insistence on fairness and principle. In 1834, he was elected to the Illinois legislature as a Whig. Politics intrigued him not as a game, but as a stage for justice. He spoke with conviction and curiosity, and over time, his voice began to rise above the prairie. He opposed the spread of slavery, though he was not yet the abolitionist he would one day become. He believed the institution was wrong, morally corrosive, and incompatible with the nation's founding ideals, but he also feared that rapid disruption would tear the country apart. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a sharp and ambitious woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Their marriage was intense and often difficult. She suffered from bouts of emotional instability, and Lincoln, himself prone to melancholy, struggled to bridge their emotional differences. But they shared a deep mutual respect and a commitment to one another and their children. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to Congress. His single term was marked by a bold opposition to the Mexican-American War, which he saw as unjust and driven by territorial greed. But his views were unpopular, and he returned to Illinois a political outsider. For years, he stepped back from public life, devoting himself to law and family. But in 1854, everything changed. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing territories to determine for themselves whether to permit slavery, reignited Lincoln's political fire. He saw in this legislation a betrayal of the nation's founding compromise and a dangerous path toward the nationalization of slavery. In speech after speech, he rose to challenge the moral and legal logic of slavery's expansion. He debated Senator Stephen A. Douglas in a series of fiery encounters that became national spectacles. Lincoln did not argue for immediate abolition, but he insisted that a house divided could not stand. The nation, he warned, would have to choose. In 1860, after years of oratory, principle, and persistence, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. His victory sent shockwaves through the South. Within weeks, states began to secede. By the time he took the oath of office in March 1861, the Union was splintering. Lincoln faced a nation unraveling before his eyes. Then came Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln approached the conflict with sorrow, not vengeance. He insisted that his goal was to preserve the Union, not to destroy the South. But as the war wore on, as blood soaked the soil of Antietam and Gettysburg, his mission evolved. He came to see the abolition of slavery not just as a necessity, but as a divine calling. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. It was a bold stroke, both moral and strategic, reshaping the war and redefining the very meaning of American freedom. That same year, at a quiet Pennsylvania battlefield, Lincoln delivered just 272 words that would echo through centuries. The Gettysburg Address, short and somber, recast the war as a struggle not only for unity, but for equality. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, he said, shall not perish from the earth. His leadership during the war was marked by anguish, perseverance, and towering vision. He faced criticism from all sides, cabinet infighting, assassination plots, and a seemingly endless river of casualties. But he never yielded to despair. He carried the weight of a nation on his back, often alone. In 1864, he was re-elected with the war still raging. But in April 1865, just days after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, just as the war was ending, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning on Good Friday. The loss stunned the world. Lincoln, once mocked as a backwoods amateur, now ascended into martyrdom. A man born in obscurity had died for the soul of his country. He was mourned not just as a president, but as a prophet. He left behind no personal wealth, no dynasty, no pretense. Only words, only ideals, only the enduring image of a man who stood tall and steady when the whole nation seemed to fall apart. Abraham Lincoln was not perfect. He doubted. He wept. He waited. But when the moment came, he rose. And in rising, he forever changed what it means to be American. He would become a symbol of perseverance, etched into American memory not only as a victorious general, but as a reluctant president who bore the weight of Reconstruction on his shoulders. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Born in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822, he was the son of Jesse and Hannah Grant, parents who valued discipline, hard work, and integrity. From a young age, Ulysses displayed a calm temperament. He wasn't boisterous or especially ambitious. He preferred the quiet company of animals, especially horses, and was known for his gentle strength and natural sense of balance in the saddle. At 17, he was nominated for West Point Military Academy. Grant didn't seek the appointment and had no passion for military life, but he accepted out of respect for his father's wishes. He arrived unpolished and awkward, and though he never ranked near the top of his class academically, he excelled as a horseman and displayed a quiet determination that hinted at the man he would become. After graduating in 1843, he served in the Mexican-American War under Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. The experience shaped him deeply. Though he fought with courage and skill, the war left him disillusioned. He viewed it as an aggressive campaign fueled by political ambition. It would be years before he raised a sword again. Following the war, Grant married Julia Dent, a woman from a Southern slave-holding family. Despite their contrasting backgrounds, their love endured for decades through long separations and financial hardship. They had 4 children, and their correspondence revealed a bond both affectionate and enduring. In peacetime, however, Grant struggled. He was assigned to remote army outposts, far from his family and opportunities. Isolated and often impoverished, Grant wrestled with depression and developed a reputation for excessive drinking. Eventually, he resigned his commission and returned home in 1854, nearly broke and unsure of his future. He tried farming, failed. Tried real estate, failed again. He ended up selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis to feed his family. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Ulysses S. Grant was largely forgotten, an out-of-work veteran with a battered past. But when the Union called, he answered. He re-entered the Army quietly, volunteering to drill recruits in Illinois. Yet in battle, his talent could not remain hidden. He earned swift promotions, and by 1862 he had captured Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, delivering the Union its first major victories. It was at Donelson that he issued his famous demand for unconditional and immediate surrender, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. But it wasn't just victories that set Grant apart, it was resilience. At Shiloh, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, Grant was caught off guard by a surprise Confederate assault. Yet he did not retreat. He regrouped, counterattacked, and ultimately won. The cost was staggering, but Grant learned from it. He grew harder, sharper, more decisive. President Lincoln took notice. Despite criticism from politicians and rival generals, Lincoln stood by Grant, declaring, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Grant continued to climb. In 1863, he orchestrated the siege and capture of Vicksburg, a fortress city vital to Confederate control of the Mississippi River. Its fall, after a brilliant and grueling campaign, split the Confederacy in two and gave the Union a strategic upper hand. By 1864, Lincoln appointed him General-in-Chief of the Union armies. Now responsible for all fronts, Grant turned his focus to Virginia and General Robert E. Lee. The overland campaign that followed was brutal. At battles like Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, casualties soared. Grant was accused of being a butcher, a man who traded lives for ground. But he pressed on, not recklessly, but with relentless resolve. He understood that only through constant pressure could the Confederacy be worn down. He laid siege to Petersburg, cutting off Lee's supply lines and tightening the noose around Richmond. In April 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant, dressed in his field uniform, accepted the surrender with grace and humility. He forbade his men from celebrating, stating, "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again." The nation rejoiced. Grant returned home a hero. His name was spoken with reverence. Streets were renamed. Children were given his name. He had not sought glory, but glory had found him. In 1868, with the country still reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the challenges of Reconstruction, Grant was elected President of the United States. But if war had revealed his strengths, peace would expose his limitations. Grant entered office with no political experience and little taste for partisan maneuvering. He trusted friends and colleagues, sometimes to a fault. His administration was plagued by corruption, not through personal greed, but through his failure to spot it. The scandals, credit mobilier, the whiskey ring tarnished his reputation and gave fodder to critics who saw his presidency as naive and mismanaged. Yet beneath the scandals lay a series of deeply consequential achievements. Grant championed the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote. He used federal troops to dismantle the Ku Klux Klan and protect African American citizens in the South. He prosecuted civil rights violations aggressively and advocated for Native American rights in a way few of his predecessors had attempted. His peace policy toward Native tribes, though imperfect, aimed to replace violence with negotiation. He served 2 terms, 8 years of turbulent effort to hold the country together after it had nearly destroyed itself. After leaving office, he embarked on a 2-year world tour, receiving acclaim from monarchs, diplomats, and common people alike. It was an unusual odyssey a humble man from Ohio embraced as a global figure. But misfortune returned. Grant made poor financial investments and was swindled by a corrupt partner. He lost his fortune. Then came cancer, throat cancer, that slowly robbed him of his strength and voice. In his final months, frail and dying, Grant began writing his memoirs. He wrote not for fame, but to provide for his family. He labored each day in agony, determined to finish. Mark Twain helped publish the work, which became an immediate success. He died just days after completing the final pages. His funeral drew millions. North and South, black and white, soldiers and civilians stood shoulder to honor him. Ulysses S. Grant had lived not for rhetoric, but for results. He was flawed, yes. He stumbled, but he always rose. He always returned. In war, he saved the Union. In peace, he sought to heal it. And in the quiet of his final words, he left a lesson more powerful than any victory. Let us have peace. And so, from obscurity to battlefield command, from scandal to redemption, Ulysses S. Grant carved a legacy not through perfection, but through perseverance. He was never the orator nor the politician, but he was the man who showed up when the Union needed him most. As the smoke of war cleared and the long, fractured road to peace began, Grant stood not as a conqueror, but as a quiet reminder that leadership is forged in fire and measured in resolve. These presidents, with their triumphs and failures, convictions and contradictions, did not merely occupy the White House. They shaped it. They left behind more than policy. They left a pattern of choices, of character tested by time. And in their stories, we find not perfection, but the enduring struggle of a nation forever striving to live up to its own promise.